There's a town in Pennsylvania that the map still remembers, but the world has almost entirely forgot. Drive through the mountains of Columbia County on a cold morning, wind your way down Route 61, and you will find something that should not exist, a place that time did not merely leave behind but actively tried to destroy. The streets are still there, the road signs still stand. The sidewalks push up through weeds and silence, but there are no people, no children running across lawns. No dogs barking behind fences. No smell of dinner coming through an open window. Just the hiss of steam rising out of cracks in the earth and the low, suffocating knowledge that beneath your feet, something has been burning for over 60 years and has absolutely no intention of stopping. This is Centralia, Pennsylvania, and its story is one of the most haunting, most heartbreaking, and most darkly fascinating stories in all of American history. To understand what happened to Centralia, you have to understand what Centralia was. And what it was for most of its existence was a dream. Not a grand dream, not a dream of empires or revolutions, but the quiet, dignified dream of ordinary people who wanted ordinary lives. A home, a job, a community, a place where their children could grow up knowing the names of their neighbors. That kind of dream, the humble kind, the kind that, when it is taken away, hurts most of all. The land that would become Centralia was originally inhabited by the Lenape people, who had lived in the forests and valleys of what is now eastern and central Pennsylvania for thousands of years. Then came the Europeans, and then came the coal. Anthracite coal, hard, black, and burning clean, was discovered beneath the hills of this region in the early 19th century, and it changed everything. The entire economy of the region reorganized itself around that black rock buried in the ground. Towns bloomed overnight where forests had stood for centuries. Men poured in from Ireland, from Wales, from Poland, from Lithuania, immigrants with calloused hands and hungry families drawn by the promise of work and wages. Centralia was incorporated in 1866, and it quickly became exactly what its founders hoped it would be: a thriving, modest, hardworking mining town. At its peak, Centralia was home to over 2,000 people. There were churches, Catholic, Protestant, Greek Orthodox, their steeples visible from the surrounding hills. There were taverns and general stores and a post office and a school. There were 4th of July celebrations and Christmas pageants and summer fairs. Generations were born in Centralia, grew up in Centralia, married in Centralia, and were buried in Centralia. The roots of that community went as deep as the coal seams below it. Deeper maybe because coal runs out. Community, people thought, was supposed to last forever. But the coal did run out. Slowly, across the 20th century, the mines closed one by one. The population began to shrink. Young people left for the cities, the old stayed behind. By 1960, Centralia still had around 1,000 residents, smaller than before, quieter than before, but still alive. Still a community, still home. The people who remained were not people who had failed to leave. They were people who had chosen to stay. There is a difference, and it matters enormously for everything that comes next. It was 1962 when everything changed. And it changed in the most absurd, most preventable, most tragically avoidable way imaginable. Centralia had a problem that many small American towns had at the time: a landfill. The town used an old strip mine pit near the edge of the borough to dump its garbage, and as the years went on, that pit filled up with trash and refuse and the ordinary debris of people's lives. The borough council decided they needed to clean it up before the Memorial Day celebration in late May. The exact details of who authorized what have been disputed for decades, but the essential fact is this: sometime around May 27, 1962, someone set the landfill on fire. This was not an unusual practice. Open burning of landfills was common in mid-century America. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was considered reasonably effective. The fire was lit, it burned, and then according to most accounts it was believed to have been extinguished, but it was not extinguished, it had found something. Deep beneath the surface of that old strip mine pit, the fire had found a vein of anthracite coal. And anthracite coal, once ignited, is extraordinarily difficult to stop. For the first few years, almost nobody noticed, or rather almost nobody wanted to notice. There were occasional complaints, a strange smell, some smoke seeping from the ground, a section of the pit that never seemed to cool down. But investigations were inconclusive or underfunded or simply not taken seriously. The residents of Centralia went about their lives. Children went to school, men went to work, women hung laundry in their yards, and beneath all of it the fire spread. Slowly, silently, invisibly, it consumed the coal veins that ran like dark arteries through the rock beneath the town. It moved outward in all directions. It deepened. It grew hotter. It became, without anyone fully realizing it, one of the largest underground coal fires in the world. The first true alarm came in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Carbon monoxide levels in some homes near the original fire site began to register on tests. Gas station owners noticed that the temperatures in their underground storage tanks were rising to dangerous levels. One reading came in at an astonishing 172 degrees Fahrenheit. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources began investigating. Attempts were made to extinguish the fire or at least to contain it. Workers dug trenches, they pumped in water, they drilled boreholes and poured in slurry. Nothing worked. The fire was too deep, too hot, and spreading through too many interconnected coal seems to be stopped by anything short of a massive, coordinated, extraordinarily expensive intervention. And that intervention never came, not in time at least. Through the 1970s, the residents of Centralia lived with an increasingly uneasy awareness that something was wrong. The evidence was everywhere if you knew where to look. Steam rose from vents in the ground even in summer. The snow melted faster in certain parts of the borough than in others because the ground beneath was warm. Gardens grew strangely in some yards, plants responding to the unusual heat below. Some homeowners began to notice cracks appearing in their foundations. The smell of sulfur drifted through certain streets on still days, and still, for much of this period, the official response was measured, cautious, slow. There were studies and reports and hearings and committee meetings and very little action. And then came February 14, 1981, Valentine's Day. A day that the people of Centralia will never forget, and a day that finally, irrevocably forced the rest of the country to pay attention. Todd Domboski was 12 years old. He was in his grandmother's backyard on a cold winter afternoon, an ordinary backyard in an ordinary neighborhood in a town that had by that point been living on top of a slow catastrophe for nearly 2 decades. Todd was walking across the yard when, without any warning at all, the ground gave way beneath his feet. A sinkhole, sudden, silent, devastating, opened up and swallowed him. He fell 4 feet into a hole that continued dropping another 150 feet into a superheated cavern below. The temperature at the bottom was nearly 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The air inside was thick with carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. Had Todd Domboski gone down much further, or had he gone down alone, he would have died. But his cousin Eric was there, and Eric grabbed his arm and held on with everything he had, and Todd was pulled to safety. The story of Todd Domboski's near-death made national headlines. Suddenly, Centralia was not a local problem or a regional curiosity. It was a crisis. Television cameras arrived. Journalists descended. The images were surreal and terrifying: a quiet residential neighborhood with steam rising from cracks in the sidewalk, with sinkholes gaping open in backyards, with carbon monoxide detectors installed in living rooms like smoke alarms. People started to leave. The ones with the means to relocate did so. The ones without the means stayed, and they were afraid. Congress got involved. In 1984, the federal government allocated $42 million for voluntary relocation of Centralia's remaining residents. Most accepted. The buyouts came through, the houses were sold to the government, and one by one the structures were demolished. Streets that had rung with the sound of children playing fell silent. Churches where generations of families had worshipped were emptied and eventually torn down. The cemetery, where the town's dead had been buried for over a century, remained. The dead do not relocate, and it still sits there today, a field of headstones in the middle of what is otherwise empty land, surrounded by the hiss of steam from the earth. But not everyone left. This is one of the most remarkable parts of the Centralia story, and the part that reveals something deeply true about human beings and their attachment to place. Even as the vast majority of residents accepted the government's offer and moved away, a small group refused. They were mostly elderly. They had lived in Centralia for decades. Their neighbors were there or had been there. Their memories were there. Their dead were buried there. And they did not believe, or they did not care, that the government had the right to force them out of a place they had called home for their entire lives. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania tried to use eminent domain to remove them. Legal battles were fought. The residents who refused to leave argued that the fire, though real and dangerous, had not yet made their specific properties uninhabitable, and that they had the right to assess that risk for themselves. It was a profound argument, the argument of people who had decided that home was worth risking their lives for. The courts did not entirely agree, and eventually the eminent domain order stood. But enforcement was delayed and appealed and delayed again, and so a tiny remnant population remained. At the peak of that remnant, there were about 50 holdouts in the 1980s. By the early 2000s, there were fewer than 20. By the time the legal battles finally wound down in the 2010s, the number had dwindled to somewhere between 7 and 10 people, the exact count depending on who was counting and when. Most of them were old. Most of them had lived there for the better part of their lives. Pennsylvania Governor Tom Corbett signed a decree in 2013 that effectively revoked Centralia's borough status and began the process of reverting the land to the state. But even that did not dislodge the final few. As of the early 2020s, A handful of elderly residents still lived in Centralia, legally under an agreement that allows them to remain in their homes for the rest of their natural lives, after which the properties revert to the state. What exists in Centralia today is something that has no real parallel in the American experience. It is not a ghost town in the traditional sense, the kind of place abandoned after a gold rush ended or a railroad bypassed it. Ghost towns are places where the reason for being disappeared. Centralia is something stranger. It is a place where the reason for being was violently, literally consumed from beneath. The infrastructure is largely still in place. The grid of streets still exists, laid out in neat blocks with curbs and gutters and utility poles. The road signs are still there. Route 61 used to pass right through the center of town, but it was closed when the pavement became too buckled and cracked from the shifting, superheated earth below. There is now a famous stretch of that old highway, cracked open and graffiti-covered, that has become a pilgrimage site for urban explorers and photographers and people drawn to the beautiful and terrible poetry of ruin. Graffiti Highway, as that stretch of Route 61 came to be known, became one of the most photographed places in Pennsylvania. People came from all over the country and beyond to walk its buckled surface, to photograph the steam rising from the hillside nearby, to stand in a place that felt genuinely post-apocalyptic, not as metaphor but as literal fact. In April 2020, the state finally had the road filled in and blocked off, but the pilgrims still come. They walk the perimeter. They photograph the vents. They stand in the old streets where houses once stood and feel the warmth rising from the ground and try to comprehend what it means for a fire to have burned for 60 years and still show no sign of stopping. Because that is perhaps the most staggering fact of all. The Centralia mine fire has now been burning continuously since 1962, 60+ years. It has burned through the Cold War and the moon landing in Vietnam and Watergate, and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the internet in September 11th and a global pandemic. It burned while the children who played in Centralia's streets grew up and had children of their own and watched those children grow up. It burned while the politicians who debated what to do about it retired and died. It burned while the forest slowly crept back in over the empty lots where homes once stood. And geologists estimate it may continue to burn for another 250 years, perhaps longer. The coal reserves beneath Centralia are deep and vast, and fire, once it has found its way into the right kind of darkness, does not easily let go. The scientific reality of what is happening under Centralia is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The fire burns through a network of interconnected coal seams at depths ranging from roughly 300 to 900 feet below the surface. The temperatures in the immediate burning zones can reach 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Toxic gases, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and various sulfur compounds seep continuously through the cracks and vents in the ground. The earth is not stable. Sinkholes form unpredictably. The very substrate of what once was a living neighborhood is being slowly, inexorably consumed from below, like the foundation of a house being eaten by invisible insects, except in this case the insects are fire and they will not be finished for centuries. Attempts to extinguish the fire were made repeatedly in the 1960s and 1970s, and each time they failed. The most commonly discussed potential solution, excavating all the burning coal from the ground, was estimated even in the 1980s to cost somewhere between $600 million and $1 billion, and it was judged to be impractical given the depth and extent of the fire's spread. Today, with the fire having spread across an estimated 400 acres or more, full excavation is not even on the table. The fire is, for all practical human purposes, unstoppable. We can only wait for it to consume all available fuel, which will take longer than any person alive today will live to see. There is a lesson in that, though it is a difficult lesson to sit with. The lesson is about systems, about the gap between the scale of human action and the scale of human consequence. Someone lit a fire in a landfill, that is the action. The consequence is a catastrophe that will outlast everyone who caused it, everyone who suffered from it, and most likely everyone currently alive on Earth. It is a lesson in how small mistakes can become permanent facts, how negligence accumulates, how the things we bury literally and metaphorically have a way of burning back up through the surface of the world. Centralia has also become, in the cultural imagination, something more than a historical tragedy. It is a place that inspires awe, the dark, uncomfortable kind of awe that humans have always felt in the presence of forces much larger than themselves. Urban explorers and photographers and writers and filmmakers have been drawn to it for decades. The video game series Silent Hill, with its imagery of a foggy abandoned town built over underground fires, is widely believed to have been inspired in part by Centralia, though the game's creators have cited multiple influences. The eerie sulfurous landscape of Centralia, steam rising from a cracked earth, empty streets, warning signs, the absence of all normal human life maps almost perfectly onto the aesthetic language of horror. It is a real place that looks like a nightmare. And yet it is also, and this must not be forgot, a real place where real people lived real lives. The horror of Centralia is not the horror of a monster or a ghost. It is the horror of loss, of the specific irreplaceable thing that is a community, the web of relationships and memories and habits and traditions and mutual recognitions that make a group of people into something more than individuals sharing a location. That thing was destroyed. It was destroyed slowly, over years, by a combination of human error and institutional failure and bureaucratic delay, and the simple, terrible indifference of systems that were not designed to protect the small and ordinary and beloved. The people of Centralia did not lose their town because they had done something wrong. They lost it because a fire was started that should never have been started, and because by the time anyone with the power to stop it was willing to commit the resources necessary to stop it, it was already too late. There is something else worth saying about those final holdouts, those 7 or 8 or 10 people who refused to leave, who looked at an official decree and a legal order and the physical evidence of a burning earth and said simply no, we are staying. Whatever you think of the wisdom of that decision, whatever the practical calculus of risk and safety, there is something in that refusal that resonates at a frequency most of us recognize. Home is not just a location. It is not just a property value or a set of coordinates. It is where you know the sound of the wind at night and the way the light falls in a certain room in a certain season and the names of the dead buried nearby. The holdouts of Centralia were not irrational. They were making a statement about what matters, a statement that the institutions around them, with their forms and their hearings and their relocation packages, were structurally unable to hear. Some of the holdouts have died since the relocation began. Others have grown very old. The community that remains is not really a community anymore. It is too small, too scattered, too reduced. But those few still there wake up every morning in the same place where they have woken up for 50 or 60 or 70 years. They see the steam rising from the vents in the earth. They feel the faint warmth through the soles of their shoes, and they stay, because for them this is still home. It always will be. Drive through Centralia today and you will feel it before you understand it. There is a quality to the silence there that is different from ordinary rural quiet. Ordinary rural quiet is the silence of things growing. Centralia's silence is the silence of something missing, of a shape in space where something used to be. You can see the outlines of what was there in the things that remain. A fire hydrant standing in the middle of a field, the curbs of streets that lead nowhere, the foundations visible in the grass where houses once stood, the old cemetery with its headstones weathering through the decades, and everywhere the vents, the cracks, the thin white columns of steam rising from the earth on cold days, visible from a distance, beautiful and terrible, like the last breath of something that has not quite finished dying. And below all of it the fire, patient, vast, older now than most of the people who have heard of it, burning through the centuries-old darkness, consuming the ancient carbon of a world that was already old when the first human beings arrived in this valley. The fire does not know about Centralia. It does not know about the town that existed above it, or the people who lived there, or the children who played in its streets, or the churches that rang their bells on Sunday mornings, or the men who went into the earth to pull coal out of it and came back up, every shift, grateful to see the sky. The fire does not know any of that, it just burns. But we know, and that is why we tell this story, because Centralia is not just a curiosity or a cautionary tale or a location for photographs. It is a mirror. It reflects back at us all the things we would rather not look at directly, our carelessness, our slowness, our habit of letting small problems grow into enormous ones because addressing them costs money and effort and political will, and it is always easier to wait and see. It reflects the gap between the power of institutions and the fragility of the communities those institutions are supposed to protect. It reflects the way that progress and neglect can look from a certain distance almost identical. And it reflects something true about fire, about how it, like many things we invite into the world carelessly, will outlast us all. The mountain above Centralia still stands. The trees on its slopes are growing back slowly, reclaiming land that was once stripped bare by mining. In spring, wildflowers bloom in the empty lots where houses stood. Birds nest in the old utility poles. The natural world, indifferent to human tragedy in its patient, beautiful way, is doing what it has always done, filling in the silences, covering the wounds, growing back over everything. In a few more generations, unless you knew where to look and what to look for, you might not know that a town once stood here at all. But the fire will still be burning, 200 feet down, 500 feet down, moving through the seams, consuming the dark, doing what fire does when it finds what it needs. Long after the last of Centralia's holdouts have lived out their extraordinary, stubborn, deeply human lives, long after the last photograph of Graffiti Highway is taken, long after the last historian writes the last account of what happened here, the fire will still be burning. And somewhere in that fact, if you sit with it long enough, if you let yourself feel the full weight of it, is a kind of terrible poetry. The story of Centralia is the story of what we leave behind, Not the memories, not the monuments, not the photographs, but the consequences. The quiet, unseen, unstoppable consequences of a single moment when someone, on an ordinary May afternoon in 1962, struck a match.